CGTN, China Global Television Network.
As the presidency of the Security Council for this month, China proposed the convening of this open debate with a view to addressing the emerging issues and challenges confronting international peace and security, as well as exploring ways to strengthen multilateralism and the role of the United Nations. Due to the rise of unilateralism and protectionism, the international order and global governance system are under attack. The world needs multilateralism and a stronger UN more than ever.
This month is China's turn to lead the United Nations Security Council. The rotational presidency is an opportunity to set the global agenda on responding to the world's most pressing issues, including peace and security. China's presidency comes amid growing threats to multilateralism, trade wars, and questions about the relevance of the United Nations. So how will China use its position to strengthen global multilateralism? And with the current challenges to stability in several African countries and China's increased presence on the continent, what actions is it likely to take to address peace and security concerns? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. And to help us unpack the expectations of China's UN Security Council presidency, I'm joined by a panel of experts. In Beijing, Professor Ho WENPING, the Director of African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. From Philadelphia, we're joined by Michael Jones, the co-founder of the National Tea Party movement. And with me in studio is Ambassador ERASTUS MWENCHA, the former Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission. Thank you all for joining us on the program. I want to get a comment from all of you at the very beginning, because China has taken over the presidency of the UN Security Council in November. It has laid out its agenda, two major agendas here, one to stir up debate at strengthening multilateralism and the other on peace and security issues. First, on multilateralism, and Ambassador MWENCHA, let me start off with you. What is your expectations in terms of China utilizing its presidency of the UN Security Council to strengthen multilateralism?
Maybe, Beatrice, before I talk about multilateralism, let me say that the UN Security Council has been a very useful instrument for global peace. This is an institution that was established soon after the Second World War, and one of the most costliest wars in the world. And since, of course, the Security Council has been guiding the global peace situation, we have had peace and relative development because of that. Now, turning to multilateralism, one of the components that was to accompany peace and security is development. And we see a lot of bilateral issues or multilateral issues that are of grave concern to the world, namely trade, climate change, and even migration, which is now becoming a major issue. We also see developments that are now anti-multilateralism. So I like to see China particularly focus on how we can continue to save the progress under the WTO that has now more or less run into a stalemate, but also looking at the issues of the climate change, which again seem to be being swept under the carpet, and the issue of peace and security, so that unilateralism doesn't become the order of the day, that we can discuss issues, whether it is in Iran or we talk about peace, protracted wars in Africa, because at the moment we seem to see a situation where there is again return either to bilateralism or unilateralism.
Right. I just want to get a sense, Professor Ho here, how much of a push do you see China making to stem the tide of protectionism here?
In terms of those efforts China has been doing, I think in the past 5 years, until now, Chinese government has put forward those ideas called like a One Belt, One Road. Initiative is trying to like share those development results and share development experience with other countries around those Belt and Road, and also to constructing those infrastructure, make it connectivity happening. So to boost, give a big push for the global economic recovery. And also like a climate change issue. Yes, China now, even now, recent days, I have been suffering about this smog, like in Beijing, so pollution is still there. But frankly speaking, this year is much better than the last year, and also much better than the previous year. So because Chinese government has make a lot of effort, like more budget for this environmental protection, right, and also our economic development model now also need to switch. Now it's gradually switch to those very environment-friendly development model, not just chasing for GDP growth rate. Now it's trying to do the green development, no longer just for chasing for those numbers. So this, I think the mindset is changing, effort has been put, and globally, like we're still in this Paris Agreement, right, not like United States now out of the Paris Agreement. We want to do more contribution for fighting like this pollution, and also push the economic growth rate higher globally.
Right. Michael Jones, we do know the sentiments of the President of the United States here, though. So in terms of China's position now, wanting to stir up debate on strengthening multilateralism during this November at the helm of the UN Security Council Presidency, your thoughts there?
Well, I think you measure commitment to multilateralism on a number of different levels. I mean, if you start with the financial contributions to the United Nations, for instance, the U.S. contributes $8 billion annually. It's far and away the largest financial supporter of the United Nations. That's, you know, over 20% of both the regular budget and of the even more of the General Assembly and the Security Council budget. So that financial commitment has been fairly unwavering. I think the position of the President, which I totally agree with, is that we want to see the United Nations that's functioning, meaning it's well and it's organized well, it's not engaged in mismanagement or fraud in several cases as it has been, and that it really is living up to its founding principles. And that means doing the things that it can do well, but also sometimes recognizing that not every problem in the world is an issue for the UN. There simply are things where countries themselves need to stand up, and also areas where issues can be addressed bilaterally. So for instance, in the issue of climate change, right, nothing precludes, you know, China, for instance, from taking its own unilateral efforts right now to do it, to cut those emissions. That would be immensely helpful to the global environment. We have attempted to do that here in the United States. Now, if that can be done additionally through the UN, obviously a broader participation, and it's even more effective. But it's important to realize that these aren't all or nothing propositions. There's many things countries can do on an individual basis.
Right, but Michael, you talk about the U.S. contributions, and the U.S. has, over the last few years, been talking about its contributions to the UN, and even including peace and security issues. The U.S. did say last year that it would be only contributing about 25% or no more than 25% to peacekeeping troops. Why does the U.S. really feel that it needs to scale back on its contributions, perhaps be it peace and security or any of those other contributions you're talking about?
Well, I think for two reasons only. One is that we're trying to get other countries to step up and play their fair share. That ultimately makes the U.S. A constructive force in making the UN, you know, more viable and better funded and better able to do its work. And second, that we're pushing for the reforms. And unfortunately, the only leverage you really have with a body of this magnitude and complexity is your financial contributions. But, you know, we have 28%, even more than the total UN budget, right, that we commit to peacekeeping initiatives, for instance. So there's lots of opportunities for other countries of the world that are right now blaming the United States for a lack of commitment to multilateralism to sort of dial down the rhetoric and up their own actions. They should be contributing more. They should be taking steps individually on many of these issues that they can do unilaterally, even while we work on multilateral solutions. And I don't believe they're doing that sufficiently.
Right, Mr. MWENCHA, yes.
You know, if you look at climate change, Africa, for instance, only contributes about 4% of the pollution. But then Africa is, at the moment, if you look at the impact that climate change is having, it is extremely unpredictable at the moment because we're having prolonged droughts, we're having unpredictable weather in terms of rain patterns and the rest. But that is aside. The issue is, how do we confront this for humanity? It is not to walk away because we all live on the same planet and we share this planet. And the answer is not for us to walk away and deny that it's not happening. Coming back to the issue of the UN, and I like the comment that was made by Michael, that the US is contributing about $1 billion. Granted, Africa has been actually in the forefront fighting for a reform. Part of that reform should be finding some equity at the level of the UN. Africa is the only continent that is not represented at the Security Council. And yet, if you look at issues that are discussed at the UN Security Council, 60% of the issues are for Africa. So the answer again is not to kill the UN and stifle it in terms of the budget and the rest, but it is to come around, and Africa has been pushing for this reform way back from the year 2000, where Africa came with the formula. The problem has been the P5, the permanent 5,
right,
have not come up with any goodwill to try and reform it, to make it more inclusive, but also to see where it needs to be fixed in terms of its governance, which we all admit that any institution needs to improve.
Right. Professor WENPING, is there a disproportionate share of responsibility here for the United States? Do you agree on that sentiment?
I think in terms of the authority of the UN and also the contribution from those big powers, including United States and China, like other countries, I think right now we are facing the danger. That is, the UN, the authority of the UN now has been gradually being marginalized, by some of those countries in the leading way. Like US, they don't even want to pay the membership fee on time to the UN, and also challenging the authority of the UN and quit a lot of UN, those sub-organizations such as UNESCO, such as the UN, the Human Rights Committee. So all of that, so put the authority of the United Nations, I think is on danger. So that's not good for all those unity of the, the global, this village, right, all those member countries in this UN. So in that way, I think we need to call for all those member countries of the UN to continue to give their support to the United Nations. Anyway, after the end of the the Second World War until now, I think the UN has played a very positive role and a very important role, and contributed a lot for maintaining the peace and the security in the world. At least we haven't seen another like the Third World War, and all those like hot spots in the different area in the continent now has been under, I think, a great attention coming from the UN, send the peacekeeping troops, and also offering other logistic support. China now offered the most, I think, the peacekeepers among those 5 permanent Security Council members. And also now we are becoming the second biggest contributor for the financial support for this peacekeeping issue. So if all the countries has been doing like this kind of way, and we will see a great this kind of capacity from the UN, and then to do those peace maintaining job.
Right. Stay with us for the moment. We will return to this discussion. We'll take a short break now, but don't go away. We'll broaden the conversation on Talk Africa in a short while. Stay tuned.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
China is an important troop contributing country of and the second largest financial contributor to the UN peacekeeping operations. At this very moment, over 2,500 Chinese peacekeepers are watching over peace with vigilance in UN missions across the world. We stand ready to join hands with all states to build a community of shared future for mankind and a more peaceful world with a better life and greater happiness for all.
That was Ambassador Ma Xiaoshu, China's permanent representative to the United Nations, speaking about the country's contribution to global peacekeeping operations. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, my guests are still with me, and I'm also joined now in London by Dr. Alex Vines. He's the head of the Africa program at Chatham House, here to infuse the European perspective from London. Dr. Vines, thank you for joining us on Talk Africa. Start off with you, though, because under its presidency of the UN Security Council this month, Africa's peace and security issues are going to be a focal point for China. Why is China making Africa's peace and security a focal point of its presidency, do you think?
Well, African peace and security tends to be one of the prime areas of discussion by the UN Security Council. It's a priority for Council discussion, and China recognizes this, and so has made it a key topic for their presidency of the Council. That's a good thing. There are plenty of agenda items to discuss, and China is becoming increasingly an important security partner in Africa, both bilaterally but also multilaterally with the UN and other organizations. So this makes perfect sense to me.
Right, Mr. MWENCHA.
Yes, indeed. The UN Security Council's deliberations and actions, about 60% of deployed UN forces are in Africa, and about 60% of the budgets in Africa is on African issues. And Africa has also taken a step to try and have more ownership on peace and security matters. In fact, Africa has submitted to the UN Security Council a proposal that in essence, seeks to get direct budget so that Africa then is able to deploy immediately, of course, with the concurrence of the UN, and that will enable Africa to avoid a situation like what happened in the case of Mali, or even in the case of Central African Republic, where Africa takes time for it to mobilize forces, make them ready for moving into theater. And of course, the reason for that is that Africa set up a number of standby forces. The structure of the African Peace and Security Council as one of the components of standby forces. And here, African member states are ready to contribute a budget to support them, and in fact, they already support them. But we would like, because UN Security Council has the overall mandate of peace and security in the world, to be part of that process. And this proposal is being, of course, discussed with the UN.
But you're talking about 60% of the peacekeeping troops being in Africa, though. And this is also coming at a time when, the European Union, for instance, and the United States as well, is talking about funding cuts to peacekeeping troops. Is this a concern for Africa, though? Is this a concern for you?
Well, it is a concern because peace and security is a shared common good globally. And you have seen what happens. I mean, when there is a breakdown in peace and security, in the case of Syria, it's not just Syria that is affected. The entire world is affected. And therefore, it's in Europe's interest if you cut peace and security but increase on development, because part of the challenge could also be because of underdevelopment. then of course that makes sense. But if you are cutting it because you want to build a wall and keep, your eyes stand off the challenges, I think that will be a very misguided direction.
Right. Dr. Alex Vines, is there a shift in priorities from the European Union when it comes to peacekeeping troops on the continent in Africa, or peace and security issues in Africa? Because we did see in 2017 the European Union was talking about slashing funding to AMISOM, for instance.
Yeah, well, AMISOM is obviously in a drawdown phase in Somalia, so you're absolutely right to point that out. The idea being that that a Somali national army takes over those responsibilities. But the EU is definitely not cutting back its funding for investment into security in the Sahel, which becomes a primary priority. And so, whereas in the Horn of Africa you see a reduction in spending, you see in the Sahel an increase in spending. So this, I think, is to do with strategic priorities, basically. I mean, there is another side of this, which is bilaterally you see significant amounts of increasing security engagement in Africa by international partners on a bilateral basis, be the United States or Turkey, United Arab Emirates, China, India. I mean, the list can go on and on. And so one of the things that does concern me is an increase of bilateral engagement and less engagement through multilateral mechanisms, including the United Nations.
Right. Professor WENPING.
Oh yes, I think all in all, Africa's peace and security, I think, still in the hands of African country and the African people themselves. All the other support, either coming from the UN or coming from China or coming from United States, I think that's just a supportive function. So I really appreciate, our ambassador just mentioned, Africa now is establishing the standby forces, and also this sub-coordination organization, those ECOWAS, IGAD, they have been doing a lot to negotiate those conflicts or hotspots in their region. For example, now South Sudan, this conflict now has been negotiated very well under the framework guided by the IGAD. So all of those things, I think we need to have a very positive point of view. So that's given the time, we will see a very good future. Actually, now that's exactly because Africa enjoying the more stable and more secure. That's why it lured in a lot of investors, including Chinese investors. Right. They want to go to Africa. So if the situation there is not that stable, you won't see so many foreign investors rushed in.
Dr. Vines, we have seen a lot of prolonged conflicts in Africa here, and China has said it will hold more than 20 meetings targeting hotspots, global hotspots, but some of them will be African hotspots, including Libya, Burundi, Somalia, and of course the Eritrean sanctions that have now been lifted this week. How is China's leadership of the peace and security, the UNSC, though, how is that going to affect decisions on Libya, on the DRC, and issues like South Sudan?
Well, there'll be plenty of consensus on some issues, and so trying to make progress on intractable crises with good offices like South Sudan will be a priority. Central African Republic, China on its watch may well see elections in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and that will be an issue given the fragility and the violence in eastern Congo that we've been seeing. The Sahel indeed hosts the peacekeeping operation that is most dangerous in the world at the moment. MINUSMA has had significant casualties, and so that will be also a priority. The reality is that there's progress in some areas, and there's real problems that look intractable and will be protracted in others. It's the very reason why the UN Security Council is so important, and that the UN system needs to be invested in and supported. I hope that China, for its good offices, can bring more consensus. It's really important to get countries working together. And my sense is that China can work well with other countries on Africa. China is not really in competition with anybody. And as we heard from the previous speaker, the need for investment and African growth is in everybody's interest. It's in Africans' interest, and it is for external partners. And so being able to cooperate, collaborate, and discuss is important, because there are other parts of the world where this just isn't happening and isn't politically able to occur, which makes what happens in Africa, I think, more important for global conversation and for global solutions.
Michael Jones, just a final comment from you in terms of China's presidency at the UNSC at the end of the month of November. What are your expectations in terms of its achievements on multilateralism and peace and security issues?
Well, there's a number of really urgent priorities that I think the UN can be helpful with on the African continent. Clearly, the elections forthcoming in the Democratic Republic of Congo are very important. The situation in Libya and the peace meetings in Italy, I think, have been hugely constructive, but also reflective of the limitations, really, of the UN. If you go back to the UN Resolution 1973 that created and authorized the use of force in this ceasefire and NATO's involvement in it, it really has created 7 years of chaos in Libya. So I believe that requires a great degree of attention. And the situation in South Sudan really continues to be immensely troubling. You know, in many respects, Africa continues to struggle with colonial borders, and there's an understanding that, you know, there's going to be independence movements, and there has to be some degree of respect for that. On the other hand, it always presents immense challenges, and the situation in South Sudan, particularly the number of children that have been you know, engaged in military conflict, the civil war itself, are all hugely troubling in areas where the UN could potentially prove very constructive.
Ambassador MWENCHA, you have the final word.
Yes, indeed. In terms of capping up, I think all one would say is that multilateralism shouldn't be weakened. I think that the dangerous trend towards nationalism is something that we must stay on guard. And of course, global peace, as we address peace, we must know that peace cannot be sustained without development. And therefore, we must twin the two and also increase. And the UN has adopted a robust program under Sustainable Development Goals. Africa has adopted a program on Agenda 2063. This should be implemented in earnest, because without development, you can't have peace, and without peace, you can't have development.
We leave it there for the moment. Thank you all for your insight. And that's all we have time for this week. And thank you to my guests for sharing your insights. Professor WENPING, the Director of African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing. Dr. Alex Vines, Chatham House in London, and Michael Jones in Philadelphia, the co-founder of the National Tea Party Movement, and Ambassador ERASTUS MWENCHA, the former Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission. Remember, you can keep the conversation going online on Facebook and Twitter, and you can also find the previous episodes of Talk Africa on YouTube and the CGTN Africa website. Tune in again next week for more analysis and in-depth conversations with Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team in Nairobi, goodbye.